Welcome, 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 welcome. And we are live today for another edition of MLK Uncut. We are reading from his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We are live on Facebook, but we're also live on my YouTube channel so that I can have my own record of these videos in case anything happens to this YouTube feature. So if you'd also like to check out my videos online on YouTube, my YouTube channel is Church Love 333. And you can check out the series by typing in MLK Uncut. So that's what these videos are being saved under. We're thankful to be doing this again today. And I'm going to go ahead and invite some of my friends in. And they can either watch live or at their leisure. That's the beauty of technology. So I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. And that we are all glad to be in the land of the living. All right. So welcome to those who are joining me live. And we're going to get started with a brief word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your love. Thank you, God, for another opportunity to breathe. Thank you, God, for another opportunity to give you thanks and to worship you. And Father God, we pray that even in this teaching today, even in this read aloud today, that we would find information, get an understanding in how we can help our current generation and how we can help our current situations that's around us today. Father, we thank you for those like MLK who have left a legacy, who have left a blueprint, and have given pathways to understanding as well as solutions. God, I thank you for every person that would watch these videos, that would hear them, that something would spark in them and ignite in them in their own environment, that they would be the change that they wish to see happen in the earth and not just have a complaint. So we thank you for it now, Jesus. Amen. All right. So we are on day 13, and we are today talking about ghettos and the Black family and bridging the chasm. It's one of the phrases that MLK uses in this particular segment. So that's where we're starting at today. I do want to say a couple of things, and one of those things is that I grew up in the ghetto. And a lot of people think that the ghetto and the projects are the same, but they're not. Kind of depending on where you live, the ghetto and the projects are not the same. So let me talk a little bit about that to begin with. Born 1977, so right before the 80s and the Reagan years and the war on drugs and all of that good stuff that was happening. I grew up in South Florida, where, you know, you've got the whole Miami Vice-ish type scenarios happening. Lots of the quote unquote war on drugs was happening in South Florida. And I didn't understand it until I got older, some of the things that I was seeing in my neighborhood as a child. But I would say this, that there were in fact police officers during that time, especially in the ghetto, who were driving into the hood with illegal goods. Um, that was something that we saw as young people happening in the daytime. It was very out in the open. It wasn't like, they weren't in the cover of night doing this. So again, we're talking today about ghettos and the family. And I'm just expressing to you that I grew up in the ghetto in South Florida, um, Miami, but the particular area that I was in at the time was called West Perrine. And if you do any research on my town, you will know that we were one of the worst crime-ridden areas. If you would think probably of the 80s, it was probably very much like the Chicago of today. So we had the crime, we had the drugs, we had the shootouts and all of those kinds of things. I'm very thankful because I was raised in a single parent household, but I had lots of relatives, aunts, uncles, grandmother, who were very involved and very active in my life. So I believe that a part of the reason why I didn't get so drawn into what was happening was because I had family members who kept an eye out on me, family members who cared about what was I doing, where was I going. To me, even though I was in the ghetto, people still cared about the children, right? There was still people in your neighborhood that you knew, that looked out for you, that if you were doing anything wrong, they would tell your parents, or they would tell your relative that they knew. And then you would have somebody in your family that would say, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? I heard from this person that you were over here and over there. Now they call them trap houses. We didn't have any name for them like that. But there were certain parts of the neighborhood that you knew, don't go down these particular streets because, there was a trap house there, or a whole line of trap houses. I had several friends, teenagers that were selling drugs, that were dealing drugs. Some of them were doing it because they couldn't get a job. Some of them started out young and got pulled into it by older drug dealers. Some of them were threatened that, hey, if you don't sell this, I'm going to do certain things to your family members. So there was different reasons why you had kids that were selling drugs, right? And I'll never forget, there's one gentleman from my neighborhood. His name was Willie Henry. Very nice guy. 16 years old, got caught up selling drugs, and some of his drugs had gotten stolen. And the people that, I guess, distributed the drugs to him basically said, we need our drugs or we need our money. So if you can't come up with the drugs or the money, we're basically going to assassinate you. And I remember that day because nobody went to school that day, because everybody was concerned about this boy being assassinated by some upper level drug dealers. And I remember, people were kind of wondering, like, what's going on? Is he going to be able to come up with the money? Is he going to be able to figure out who took the drugs? That kind of thing. Well, the reality was he didn't come up with the money, and he didn't find out who took the drugs. And these drug dealers came through the neighborhood and they executed him in broad daylight, shot him up several times, and his body lay in the street. Now, nobody knew who these people were. It was like it was a drive-by. Nobody saw faces. But I would probably say that was one of the saddest days in my neighborhood, because here I am, a younger person. I probably was like going into middle school. So I was pretty young. But the reality was that moment of seeing someone or hearing someone, because I didn't see it, but I saw the aftermath because his body just lay out in the streets until the coroner came to get it, until they put the yellow sheet on top of him. West Perrine at the time, Dade County, West Perrine area, was probably one of the last places that a coroner would go into to get dead bodies. So it was not uncommon for people to be shot and killed in our community and their bodies just lay out in the streets until someone came and covered it up and the coroner came to get their body. So experiencing that and hearing about it, that somebody that I knew just a few, just a day ago was alive, and then next thing you know, they're executed because of their involvement in drug dealing, in drug operations. That was enough for me to know that I didn't ever want to, number one, be connected with a drug dealer in terms of, oh, I have a drug dealing boyfriend. That's so cool. Not so. Didn't want to be connected with somebody who dealt drugs. Didn't want to be in an area where there was a trap house and I could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And didn't want my family to be caught up in something like that because it was a tragedy. The whole neighborhood mourned because this boy's life was cut short over drugs and a drug operation. And so, as I said before, I saw officers bringing drugs into my neighborhood. So when somebody talks to me or tells me about the war on drugs, you're not going to convince me that Black people are just bringing drugs into their neighborhood, or Black people are just all of a sudden finding weapons to start these kinds of battles or wars between people who sell drugs on one corner and somebody sells drugs in another section of the neighborhood. All of that comes from somewhere. And as one gentleman said, talking to even some of the young people in Chicago, that they will wake up in the morning and they will find boxes of guns just sitting out in their neighborhood. And so while we're talking about what's wrong with the Black community, while we're talking about what's wrong with the ghetto, let's also be honest about the intentional placement of certain things in the community to tear it up. So if we want to talk about the ghetto and how bad it is and what's going on, let's also talk about America's responsibility in allowing certain things to be planted in Black communities to bring disruption to a community. Let's talk about some of the policies surrounding welfare, right? Because obviously I grew up in the ghetto, so I saw, welfare. I saw generations of people on welfare, grandmother on welfare, daughter on welfare, granddaughter on welfare. And so growing up in the ghetto, I started to notice, hey, these people have been on welfare for 3 generations. These people have been, why is that? Why are they on welfare for 3 generations? Well, part of it had to do with policy. Now, we know that policy with receiving welfare has changed, gone back and forth. Restrictions have been added, then restrictions have been taken away. But I will say that part of that issue had to do with, number one, how long you could stay on it. So it became not a help, right? It became a crutch. Number two, how many kids you could have, right? So I know at one point with the welfare system, your payments would increase based on the number of kids you had, until they put something in place that said, at a certain amount of children that you have, we're going to cap the increase of your payments, right? Then there was the issue of, if you were on welfare, you couldn't work at all. At first it was you couldn't work at all. So that policy doesn't motivate people to go get a job. Then that policy changed to, okay, you can be on welfare and you can work, and you need to work at least 20 hours. And then it had to do with the types of jobs that you had. So what am I saying? I'm saying that if you want somebody to get off of a system, right, you have to be able to create policy that does not handicap that person or makes it more beneficial for them to stay on something that's only really supposed to help lift you out of a situation. So if we kind of look at what happened with welfare, what happened with the war on drugs, what happened with sentencing, right? People are now talking about the fact that these harsh sentences were given for non-violent crimes, where people were being sentenced to 20, 30, 40 years for having a small amount of marijuana, right? Because that was big, selling marijuana or selling dope. There were differences in sentencing based on if you were selling crack cocaine or powdered cocaine, right? So all of this played a part in what we see happening, or what we saw happen in the ghetto, right? You saw people going away, especially fathers, men who were selling drugs for nonviolent crimes. They were being put in jail 20, 30, 40 years. So then you had Bill Clinton's 3-strike rule, right? But he didn't get that put into legislation just by himself, as people like to say, but there were other people on both sides of the fence that approved the harsh sentencing. So now here we are, and people are still kind of arguing through these things. They're working through them. They're trying to figure out, well, how can we correct some of the things that was done policy-wise, So I just wanted to open up with that. You know, a lot of times people, when they hear you talk, they don't think that you have a background and know what you're talking about. I understand that's normal on Facebook. So I'm saying all of this in the backdrop of understanding that, yes, the ghetto had problems, but the ghetto did not have problems in a vacuum. There were some things that happened government-wise, policy-wise, through corruption. Also through corruption, and good morning to everybody who's watching live. Also through corruption that played a part in what we see today in neighborhoods. So I personally have a problem with everybody talking about what's wrong with the Black community or what's wrong with the ghetto, and they're refusing to acknowledge the government's part in what happened. So we're gonna talk about what's wrong, right? We can't just keep pointing the finger at Black people and saying, this is why. No. We all need to repent. Everybody who played a part, everybody who got involved, bad policies from the government, bad policing, corrupt officers, all of that needs to be repented for. So just wanted to make that clear before we go into MLK's next section, which he starts out by calling the dilemma of Negro Americans. But today we're breaking it down into this section where he goes into talking about ghettos and the Black family. And let me say, everything is not bad about the hood. Again, there's the ghetto, there's the projects. There are people in the hood, there are people in the ghetto who are working. They work hard. They have 2 and 3 jobs. There are people in the hood who are taking care of their families. There are people in the hood who have 2-parent homes. So if you have not been to a hood lately, I suggest you go. Especially if you have lots of commentary about the hood and you've never been. I suggest you take a field trip. Yeah, take a field trip and see what actually is going on in the hood. Spend about 7 days there, at least a week. So you can make your own assessment of the hoods in your vicinity and see what's actually really going on. Because I do believe that there is some good in the hood, right? My family owns a corner store in the hood. There are small business owners in the hood. So it's not all bad. And I think that if more people would spend some time getting to know and getting to see and getting to hear what's happening, then they would be in a better position to actually help. All right. So MLK starts out by talking about ghettos and the Black family, and that is where we're going to start today. All right. The dilemma of white America is the source and cause of the dilemma of Negro America. Just as the ambivalence of white Americans grows out of their oppressor status, the predicament of Negro Americans grows out of their oppressed status. It is impossible for white Americans to grasp the depths and dimensions of the Negro's dilemma without understanding what it means to be a Negro in America. Of course, it is not easy to perform this act of empathy. Putting oneself in another person's place is always fraught with difficulties. Over and over again, it is said in the Black ghettos of America that no white person can ever understand what it means to be a Negro. There is good reason for this assumption, but there is very little in the life and experience of white America that can compare to the curse this society has put on color. And yet, if the present term of hostility, fear, and distrust is to be bridged, the white man must begin to walk in the pathways of his Black brothers and feel some of the pain and hurt that throb without let up in their daily lives. The central quality in the Negro's life is pain. Pain so old and so deep that it shows in almost every moment of his existence. It emerges in the cheerfulness of his sorrow songs, and in the melancholy of his blues. In the pathos of his sermons, the Negro, while laughing, sheds invisible tears that no hand can wipe away. In a highly competitive world, the Negro knows that a cloud of persistent denial stands between him and the sun, between him and life and power, between him and whatever he needs. In the words of a noble Black bard of yesteryear, Paul Laurence Dunbar, he says, "A crust of bread and a corner to sleep in, a minute to smile and an hour to weep in, a pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never a laugh, but the moans come double, and that is life." Negro life. Being a Negro in America means being scarred by a history of slavery and family disorganization. Negroes have grown accustomed now to hearing unfeeling and insensitive whites say, other immigrant groups such as the Irish, the Jews, and the Italians started out with similar handicaps, and yet they made it. Why haven't the Negroes done the same? These questioners refuse to see that the situation of other immigrant groups 100 years ago and the situation of the Negro today cannot be usefully compared. Negroes were brought here in chains long before the Irish decided voluntarily to leave Ireland, or the Italians of leaving Italy. Some Jews may have left their homes in Europe involuntarily, but they were not in chains when they arrived on these shores. Other immigrant groups came to America with language and economic handicaps, but not with the stigma of color. Above all, no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil, and no other group has had its family structure deliberately torn apart. I'm going to say those two things again. Above all, no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil, and no other ethnic group has had its family structure deliberately torn apart. That is the rub. Today, there is considerable discussion about the disintegration of the Negro family in the urban ghettos. We need only to learn something about the special origins of the Negro family to discover the root of the problem. The Negro family for 300 years has been on the tracks of the racing locomotives of American history, dragged along, mangled, and crippled. Pettigrew has pointed out that American slavery is distinguished from all other forms of slavery because it consciously and intentionally dehumanized the Negro. This is another thing that we tend to overlook. And I'm going to sip on that. Consciously and intentionally dehumanizing a people group. In Greece and Rome, for example, slaves preserved dignity and a measure of family life. Our institution of slavery, on the other hand, began with the breakup of families on the coast of Africa. Because the Middle Passage was long and expensive, African families were torn apart in the interest of selectivity, as if the members were beasts. In the ship's holds, black captives were packed spoon fashion to live on a voyage, often lasting 2 to 6 months, in a space for each the size of a coffin. If water ran short or famine threatened or a plague broke out, whole cargoes of living and dead people were thrown overboard. So you can't talk about why isn't the black family together without acknowledging your part in structurally and systematically tearing apart the black family. Yeah, gonna keep reading. The sheer physical torture was sufficient to murder millions of men, women, and children, but even more incalculable was the psychological damage. Of those families who survived the voyage, many more were ripped apart on the auction block as soon as they reached American shores. Against this ghastly background, the Negro family began life in the United States. On the plantation, the institution of legal marriages for slaves did not exist. Now, you would think that these things would be taught in public school, but I can tell you, as a teacher who taught for 15 years, that they're not. So, if you aren't getting basic education about America's part in slavery and America's part in destruction of a black family, then yes, you're going to go around thinking that something is just wrong with these black people. I don't know why they can't get it together. So let's keep reading. The masters might direct mating, or if they did not intervene, marriage occurred without sanctions. There were polygamous relationships, fragile monogamous relationships, illegitimacies, abandonment, and the repetitive tearing apart of families as children, husbands, or wives were sold to other plantations. So, again, this whole tearing apart of the black family didn't just start in 2016. This whole, as he says here, the repetitive tearing apart, the repetitive, your husband and your wife, even if you tried to get married illegally, were still torn apart. Slave breeding, and we talked about that in another section of slave making, of how you're injecting incest into this because you had mothers that were forced to sleep with sons because they were treated like animals. They didn't care that they were breeding mothers with sons to create more slaves. It was a business. They were not treated humanely. But he goes on to say, these cruel conditions were not yet the whole story. Masters and their sons used Negro women to satisfy their spontaneous lust, or, when more humane attitudes prevailed, as concubines. The depths were reached in Virginia, which we sentimentally called the state of presidents. There, slaves were bred for sale, not casually or incidentally, but in a vast, deliberate program which produced enormous wealth for slaveholders. This breeding program was one answer to the legal halting of the slave traffic in the 19th century. So again, once you could no longer import slaves over, they had to figure out a way to keep their slave business going. So that brought us to slave breeding in the United States to continue to have slaves to perpetuate this generation after generation so that their business could keep going. Against these odds, the Negro family struggled to survive through the antebellum era, and miraculously many did. In all this psychological and physical horror, many slaves managed to hold on to their children and develop warmth and affection and family loyalties against the smashing tides of emotional corruption and destruction. The liberation from slavery in 1863, which should have initiated the birth of a stable Negro family life, meant formal legal freedom, but as Henrietta Buckmaster put it, with Appomattox, 4 million Black people in the South owned their skins and nothing more. With civil war still dividing the nation, a new inferno engulfed the Negro and his family. Thrown off the plantations, penniless, homeless, still largely in the territory of their enemies and in the grip of fear, bewilderment, and aimlessness, hundreds of thousands became wanderers. So you're talking about tracing this back to why do we have the dysfunctions we have continuing on today? These 4 million Black people, and as she says here, they owned their backside and nothing more. But you're saying you're free now. Go be free. Go be successful. Go prosper. But they own their backside and nothing more. Keep in mind, that's not the story for other immigrants who came to this country. They were given, because we like to say if you give something to Black people, then, you know, it's welfare and it's entitlement and they don't deserve to be given anything. But other immigrants that came to this country were given an economic flooring. And they weren't coming out of chattel slavery, but they were given an economic flooring. So let's keep reading. For security, these Black people in the South fled to Union Army camps that were unprepared to help them. So you have the North comes down, frees them, but then they're unable to help them after they free them. One writer describes a mother carrying a child in one arm, a father holding another child, and 8 other children with their hands tied to one rope held by the mother, who struggled after Sherman's army and traveled hundreds of miles to safety. All were not so fortunate. In starvation-induced madness, in the starvation-induced madness. Because remember, you just released 4 million people into nothingness. They don't own anything. They don't have jobs. All they have is the clothes on their back and their children. That's it. Yes, ma'am. And other immigrants are still given an economic flooring when they come to this country. That's why they're coming. That is why they're coming. Some of us need to go and look at USA.gov and how much aid, how much help financially, how many loans are given to immigrants that come to this country to start businesses. So they're given an economic flooring when they come here. This is why you see so many things in the Black neighborhoods that are not owned by Black people. Some of them are coming with economics from their country, but many of them are not. So all you have to do is research immigration, immigrant loans, loans given to immigrants coming to this country, and you will see why there is still an economic gap, why there is still a gap between Black business ownership versus those coming in to our country. All right. So let's look at what's happening here. Because of this starvation-induced madness that was going on, you released 4 million slaves whose only job occupation has been domestic or agricultural, which means you're releasing them into a society in which they cannot compete unless they are given a agricultural or domestic job. You're releasing them with their children. You're releasing them with nothing but the clothes on their back and their children. Not food to eat, not shelter. And they did put out a law. They did try to push through a law to at least give Blacks an economic footing. Many people don't know this. They did. They tried to push through a law that said, let's give the Negro $100, 40 acres, and a mule. That's where that came from. Because they actually did try to give that person free during that time. But guess what happened? President Andrew Jackson at the time became president after they assassinated Lincoln, who more than likely would have approved that. So they assassinated him. Andrew Jackson becomes president, and they push that bill out. This is why it's important to know your history. So they realized, this government did realize that they pushed or they freed Black people and gave them no economic flooring. I don't know what's going on with this current generation, with this current generation that's acting like America does not have a debt to pay to Black America, because the reality is they do. So because of this starvation that happened, you've got all these people being released. He says some Negroes killed their children to free them of their misery. Some Negroes killed their children to free them of their misery. Well, guess what's happening in great numbers in the Black community today? Because of the level of poverty, because Planned Parenthood, which is nothing more than a genocide chamber, a death chamber situated in most Black and brown neighborhoods, because of the poverty levels, Black women, especially in the poor neighborhoods, are being convinced, well, you might as well abort your child because, hey, you don't want them to starve. You don't want them to suffer. You don't want them, to be going through life in a miserable state. So one of the reasonings of Black women killing their children is, I don't want them to suffer. I don't want them to have this life of misery. And at some point, we've got to, and it is happening, but it needs to happen more. We've got to tell these mothers that taking a life is something that you will remember for the rest of your life. That's number one. Number two, God honors life. Number three, children are a blessing and a heritage from the Lord. Number four, without children, there is no Black race. There is no black people group. There is no black future. So even then, the situation was so dire that Negroes were killing their children to free them of their misery. So rather than watch them starve to death because of what they had been released into, they were killing their children. All right. These are historical facts. If they cause your mind to reel in horror, they should. Just bottom line. It is still necessary to realize that this is but a tiny glimpse of the reality of the era, and it does justice neither to the enormous extent of the tragedy nor to the degree of human suffering and sorrow. Following the Civil War, millions returned to a new form of slavery, once again imprisoned on plantations, devoid of human rights, and plunged into searing poverty generation after generation. So what started happening after the Civil War? Well, my great-grandmother and my grandmother participated in a system that they called sharecropping. Okay, so you had a lot of these people that were like, okay, you released us and you freed us, but we don't have anything. So some of them still wound up having to go back into a lower system of slavery, but it was still slavery. Some of them wound up having to go back to those plantations, or if they began traveling, they wound up at another plantation serving as a sharecropper. And just briefly, sharecropping, they allow you to work a part of the land in exchange for, you getting some food from that land or whatever. But the reality was, it was a system still that they could never get ahead in. Why? And I'm going to go to a part 2 because I see that this I see that this Facebook Live is starting to freeze. So come right back. I'm going to do part 2 as we finish up here, but I don't want this to cut off on us. So I'm going to come right back and do part 2. So give me just 1 minute. I will restart, and please come back in and join us as we talk about these systems. Thank you. Thank you all for bearing with me. All right, we are back. We have been talking about ghettos and the Black family. Ghettos and the Black family. And this is part 2. Ghettos and the Black family. All right. So trying to invite some people back in. If you are with me and everything is clear, please put a thumbs up. If you're able to come back in. Let's see. If you're able to come back in. This is freezing. Thank you all for being patient with me. Thank you for your patience. Patience. Thank you, Lord. All right. We're back again. Let's see if we can get this rolling. All right. This looks to be pretty clear. Thank you all who are watching by YouTube live stream. Thank you for your patience. Again, these videos can be found on my YouTube channel, Church Love 333. Church Love 333, which has not had any problems with live streaming today, thankfully. All right. So I see some thumbs up. So I'm assuming that the screen is clear and we are able to continue on in our discussion. So we were talking about, thank you, we were talking about sharecropping, right? So they moved from, when we're talking about the Black family that has moved from slavery, they've been set free with nothing. And said, you know, and the attitude is, you're free to go and be miserable, you're free to, you know, starve to death, you're free to not have an economic flooring, you're free, but we don't plan to help you. So it's almost the attitude, you know, even of an abuser, where, you know, had you stayed with me, had you stayed in slavery, you would have had all of your needs met, all of your needs taken care of, right? But since you want to be free, we'll let you go free. You just can't take anything with you. So again, they returned to a new form of slavery, which was sharecropping, because I could work a certain piece of ground in exchange for, you know, I could work the ground and then you would pay me, supposedly, for my working of this ground. But one of the things that happened, they could never get out of this system. They can actually never get free from it, because the slave owner who they were working for, you're welcome, the slave owner who they were working for would deduct, you know, they would say, well, here's what you earned, right, from working this ground. Here's the money we made. But let me charge you for your clothing, let me charge you for your tools, let me charge you for this, let me charge you for that. So by the time the slave master got down to actually paying them, it was pennies, because they nickel and dime them, supposedly based on, charging them for all of these things, even though they were still working this ground pretty much for free. So again, it turned into a new form of slavery, which once again imprisoned on plantations devoid of human rights and plunged into searing poverty generation after generation. So that's not too far from my generation, because my grandmother came out of sharecropping in the Georgia area. And she was able to share with us some of the stories of her family and what they dealt with in sharecropping. Some families found their way to the north in a movement E. Franklin Frazier describes as into the city of destruction. Because remember, if they're fleeing the south and all their job skills have to do with domestic work and agricultural, and they're fleeing to the north is being industrialized. So you still have, as they call it, into the city of destruction, because attitudes in the north had not changed about slavery. You have people, as he says here, they're illiterate. Remember, it was illegal to read. So very few of the people being released are being released as literate people, or as people that have an adequate education to be working in the north. So they're illiterate, they're afraid, and they're crushed by want or hunger. And so as these people move from the south to the north, many of them were herded into the slums of the north. All right. The bewildering complexity of the city undermined the confidence of fathers and mothers, causing them to lose control of their children, whose bewilderment was even more acute. Once more, the Negro's problem had two cutting edges. Because the institution of marriage had been illegal under slavery, and because of indiscriminate sexual relations, often with their white masters, mothers could identify their children, but frequently not their children's fathers. So you have these stereotypes, right, that live on today of what? Blacks not wanting to be married, blacks having indiscriminate sexual relationships, so they're just sleeping around with everybody. You even have shows based off of who's the daddy, right? Or that is not the father. But we look at where this started. Where did it start? Why couldn't mothers identify their children? Why couldn't mothers identify their children's fathers? Right? What was going on? So women being more generally in the house, yes. And the curses were not begun by Black America. And this is something that America refuses to acknowledge. So you start conditions that curse generations, but you don't want to own up to the conditions that you started. Okay? So the women being more generally in the house and charged with the care of the white master's children were more often exposed to some education and a sense through minimal of personal worth. Hence, this is very important, a matriarchy, yes, a matriarchy had developed early. So we have this culture in the Black community, right, where the mother is highly revered. Look at all the stuff that has happened with the shootings, and you see all of these mothers on display holding pictures of their sons up. Never mind that some of these mothers are married to. There were teenagers that were killed that were in two-parent families, but that's not projected by media. Very rarely, if you go back and look, very rarely will you see the interviews of the husband and the wife being interviewed about the death of their son. But you will see on the campaign trail, you will see women standing up whose sons have been killed holding pictures of their sons. So we're going back to, where did this come from? And he's telling you, he's saying women who were in charge in the house, they were charged with caring for the master's children. So those women were exposed more to education and opportunity than the others were. So once they're released, 4 million people, once they're released, who takes over the lead in the family? It's the one who is more educated. Hence, a matriarchal system developed within the Black family. After slavery, it persisted because in the city, there was more employment for women than men. That is still true in 2016. There is more employment opportunity for Black women than men. There is more economic advancement available for Black women than there are men. There are more business grants available for Black women than there are men. Black women, out of any other people group right now, are the most educated. But you have to understand the system that was in operation. So if I am the matriarch, if this system of matriarchy has developed, yes, this system of matriarchy was developed because it further disintegrated the family. Though both were unskilled, the women could be used in domestic service at low wages. The woman became the support of the household, and the matriarchy was reinforced because somebody had to work. Somebody has to take care of the kids. Somebody is going to be pulled out of the family structure, and because she had the most education and the most ability to get a job in the city, right? Because agriculture is not really happening in the North, then that further reinforces the woman being in charge of the household. This is why we have to teach. All right? Root and not fruit. The Negro male existed in a larger society dominated by men, but he was subordinated to women in his own society. I'll say it again. The Negro male existed in a larger society dominated by men, but he was subordinated to women in his own community, in his own society. Yes, that is actually true. The quest of the Negro male for employment was always frustrating. If he lacked skill, he was only occasionally wanted because such employment as he could find had little regularity and even less remuneration. If he had a skill, he also had his Black skin, and discrimination locked doors against him. In the competition for scarce jobs, he was a loser because he was born that way. His rage and torment were frequently turned inwardly because if they gained outward expression, their consequences could be fatal. So the Negro father became resigned to hopelessness and he communicated this to his children. Some men, unable to contain the emotional storms and their feelings of uselessness, struck out at those who would least likely be able to destroy them. They beat their wives and their children in order to protest a social injustice, and the tragedy was that none of them understood why the violence exploded. The shattering blows on the Negro family have made it fragile, deprived, and often psychopathic. This is doubly tragic because nothing is so much needed as a secure family. You need a secure family life for people seeking to rise out of poverty and backwardness. History continues to mock the Negro today because just as he needs ever greater family integrity, severe strains are assailing family life in the white community. Delinquency is not confined to the underprivileged. It is rampant among the middle and upper social strata, and more than one observer argues that juvenile delinquency is a product of widespread adult delinquency. So you can't have, as he's pointing out here, you can't have juveniles who are delinquent without first dealing with the adults who are delinquent, without dealing with the dysfunction happening in adults, without dealing with the absence and presence of adults. For example, if I'm talking to a parent who is 36, or if I'm talking to a parent who is 24, and her mother, which would be the student's grandmother, is 36, and the student is 12, clearly you can see a problem there, right? I'll say it again. If I have a student in my class who's 12, her mother is 24, and her mother, or the student's grandmother, is 36, clearly there's a problem. Adulthood. One of them is really just entering into adulthood. So there's a larger problem going on. Robert, there's a larger problem going on, right, than just juvenile delinquency. It started before the juvenile that got in my class. It started with a generational pattern that this student that's in my class is acting out in. I'll say it again because this is actually a real scenario. If the student in my class is 12 and her mother is 24 and her mother is 36, that's a generational issue I have to deal with. It didn't just start with the 12-year-old in my class that thinks that they know everything, right? That means that the 12-year-old's mother had her when she was 12, and the grandmother had the mother when she was 12. So that's a generational issue that's now sitting in my classroom. I have to look at it beyond how is this student acting out in my class. I've got to now go back and say, what's going on with grandmother? What's going on with mother? Because if I can go back and I can address what's going on with grandmother and mother, it's going to fix what's happening in my class. Unfortunately, most educators don't have time for that because of the demands of maybe 25 to 30 other students in their class, the demands of curriculum, the demands of testing and testing and testing and testing. So again, he's saying juvenile delinquency is a product of a widespread adult delinquency. Where are the adults? What has happened with the adults? We're talking about in this segment, because there is a part 1, so please make sure you go back and see that. We're talking about the Black family, ghettos, the history of the Black family, and how we got to where we are today. All right. In short, the larger society is not at this time a constructive educational force for the Negro. The dark side of the picture appears to make the future bleak, if not hopeless. Yet something says this is not true. Back on the coast of Africa, mothers fought slave traders fiercely to save their children. They even offered their bodies to the slavers if they would leave their children behind. On some slave ships that are known, and many that may never be known, manacled Negroes crawled from the holds and fought unarmed against guns and knives. On slave plantations, parents fought, stole, sacrificed, and died for families. After liberation, countless mothers wandered over roadless streets looking for the children who had been taken from them and sold. And finally, in the past decade, mothers, fathers, and their children have marched together against clubs, guns, cattle prods, and mobs, not for conquest, but only to be allowed to live as human beings. The Negro was crushed, battered, and brutalized, but he never gave up. He proves again that life is stronger than death. The Negro family is scarred, it is submerged, but it yet struggles to survive. If you're just coming in, we are reading from Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And this is the last book that was written by MLK before he was assassinated. And he is now talking about the dilemma of Black people in this country. And we are focused on his segment here today where he's talking about the Black family. 100 times I've been asked why we have allowed little children to march in demonstrations, to freeze and suffer in jails, to be exposed to bullets and dynamite. The questions imply that we have revealed a want of family feeling or that we are reckless toward our own family security. The answer is simple. Our children and our families are maimed a little every day of our lives. If we can end this incessant torture by a single climatic confrontation, the risks are worth it. Moreover, our family life will be born anew if we fight together. Other families may be fortunate enough to be able to protect their young from danger. Our families, as we have seen, are different. Oppression has again and again divided and splintered our families. We are a people torn apart from era to era. It is logical, moral, and psychologically constructive for us to resist oppression united as a family. Out of this unity, out of the bond of fighting together, forges will come. The inner strength and integrity will make us whole again. The most optimistic element revealed in any review of the Negro family's experience is that the causes for its present crisis are culturally and socially induced. What man has torn down, he can rebuild. At the root of the difficulty in Negro life today is pervasive and persistent economic want. To grow from within, the Negro family, and especially the Negro man, needs only fair opportunity for jobs, education, housing, and access to culture. These are things in 2016 that Black America is still asking for. That ought to concern us. Fair opportunity. Not special, fair. Fair opportunity for jobs, education, housing, and access to culture. To be strengthened from the outside requires protection from the grim exploitation that has haunted the Negro for 300 years and counting. The Negro family lived in nature's jungle in Africa and subdued the hostile environment. In the United States, it has lived in a man-made social and psychological jungle, which it has yet to subdue. Many have been destroyed by it, yet others have survived and developed a capacity for hardships. It is on this strength that society must now begin to build. Wow. As public awareness of the predicament of the Negro family increases, there will be danger and opportunity. The opportunity will be to deal fully rather than haphazardly with the problem as a whole, to see it as a social catastrophe brought on by years of brutality and oppression, and to meet it as other disasters are met, with an adequacy of resources. The danger will be that the problems will be attributed to Negro weaknesses and used to justify further neglect and to rationalize continued oppression. Many of the ugly pages of American history have been obscured and forgotten. A society is always eager to cover its misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness. But no society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. America owes a debt of justice which it has only begun to pay. If it loses the will to finish or slackens its determination, history will recall its crimes, and the country that would be great will lack the most indispensable element of greatness, which is justice. Being a Negro in America means not only living with the consequences of a past slavery and family disorganization, but facing this very day the pangs of color shock. Because the society with unmitigated cruelty has made the Negro's color a curse, every child suffers a traumatic emotional burden when he encounters the reality of his black skin. In Dr. Kenneth Clark's classic study, Prejudice and Your Child, there's a simple test for color sensitivity in young children. This involves having a child draw a tree, an apple, and the child, and then to proceed to color each one at will. One of my colleagues reported conducting this test with his 3-year-old daughter. The child, holding the crayon, deftly and delicately colored the tree green, and then in the same way shaded the apple red. But when it came to coloring the child, she gripped the crayon with her fist and in a violent pattern of chaotic motions made purple slashes across the figure. This was a child living in a Long Island suburb, not in the Deep South. Her parents were well educated and sensitive to the child's emotional health. But in America, there is no escape from the awareness of color and the fact that our society places a qualitative difference on a person of dark skin. Every Negro comes face to face with this color shock, and it constitutes a major emotional crisis. It is accompanied by a sort of fatiguing, wearisome hopelessness. If one is rejected because he is uneducated, he can at least be consoled by the fact that it's possible for him to get an education. If one is rejected because he is low on the economic ladder, he can at least dream of the day he will rise from economic deprivation. If one is rejected because he speaks with an accent, he can at least work to bring his speech in line with the dominant society. If, however, one is rejected because of his color, he must face the fact that he is being rejected because of something in himself that cannot be changed. All prejudice is evil, but the prejudice that rejects a man because of the color of his skin is the most despicable expression of man's inhumanity to man. Being a Negro in America means being herded in ghettos or reservations, being constantly ignored or made to feel invisible. You long to be seen or to be heard and be respected, but it is like blowing in the wind. Wow. Most people are totally unaware of the darkness of the cave in which the Negro is forced to live. A few individuals can break out, but the vast majority remain its prisoners. Our cities have constructed elaborate expressways and elevated skyways, and white Americans speed from suburb to inner city through vast pockets of black deprivation without ever getting a glimpse of the suffering and misery in their midst. But while so many white Americans are unaware of conditions inside the ghetto, there are very few ghetto dwellers who are unaware of the life outside. Their television sets bombard them day by day with the opulence of the larger society. From behind the ghetto walls, they see glistening towers of glass and steel springing up almost overnight. They hear jetliners speeding over their heads at 600 miles an hour. They hear the satellites streaking through outer space and revealing details of the moon. Then they begin to think of their own condition. They know that they are given the hardest, ugliest, most menial work to do. They look at these impressive buildings under construction and realize that almost certainly they cannot get those well-paying construction jobs because the trade unions have been reserving them for whites only. They know that people who built the bridges, the mansions, the docks of the South could build modern buildings if they were given a chance for apprenticeship training. They realize that it is hard, raw discrimination that shuts them out. It is not only poverty that torments the Negro, it is the fact of poverty amid plenty. It is a misery generated by the gulf between the affluence he sees in mass media and the deprivation he experiences in his everyday life. Living with the daily ugliness of slum life, educational castration, and economic exploitation, some ghetto dwellers now and then strike out in spasms of violence and self-defeating riots. A riot is at bottom the language of the unheard. It is the desperate suicidal cry of one who is so fed up with the powerlessness of his cave existence that he asserts he would rather be dead than ignored. Turing Watts, a few days after that nightmarish riot in 1965, Bayard Rustin, Andrew Young, and I confronted a group of youngsters who said to us after the Watts riots, "We won." We asked them, "How can you say you won when 34 Negroes are dead, your community is destroyed, and whites are using the riot as an excuse for inaction?" Their answer was, "We won because we made them pay attention to us." In my closing, as long as people are ignored, as long as they are voiceless, as long as they are trampled by the feet of iron exploitation, there is the danger that they, like little children, will have their emotional outbursts, which will break out in violence in the streets. MLK has said a lot today. He's given us a lot to think about. He's begun to kind of walk us through the ghetto, walk us through where did the dysfunction in families come from? How did Black women become the head of households? What is going on with the systemic issues in the ghetto? And he's really driving home the point that it's not enough for the few to make it out, but we've got to start improving the condition of the Black community as a whole. So I hope that you're getting something out of these readings. And if you just came in to part 2, if you will, please go back and watch part 1 of today, where I do share a little bit about my growing up in the ghetto. Tomorrow, we're going to continue as MLK talks about ghettos and inequality. So we will continue this segment on tomorrow, where he talks about ghettos and inequality. Thank you for viewing live. Thank you for sharing this on your page. And hopefully we are helping you. Hopefully you're getting an understanding of some of the problems that still face the Black community today. And hopefully you're seeing a little bit of what the problem is, and you're thinking about, how can I be a solution right where I am, right where I am. So that was our reading for today. Thank you for viewing, and take care, and God bless. And thank you for viewing. Take care and God bless.